Hello there and welcome to your video on Islam. For today's video I am actually going to be seated, and I'm hoping this works, in my 1960s Saudi Arabia official camel saddle, which is actually quite comfortable. Here we go. Alright, so what do we know about Islam? Well, it is the youngest of the major world religions at about 1400 years old. And what I do find quite fascinating about it is Islam comes from the same root, the SLM sound, as the word shalom. Basically, the word Islam means peace. People who follow Islam are Muslims, and Muslims are those who submit to God. They find peace through this submission. All right? So, how in the world does this religion form? Well, we're going to do a little history first. Are you all ready for this? So essentially what happens is Islam sees itself as the inheritor of the lineage of Moses, then Jesus, who is known as Isa, and then you end up with Muhammad, who is the seal of the prophets. So it sees itself as part of the Abrahamic religion and really as a continuation of these teachings. When Islam forms, it is founded essentially by Muhammad, and it's kind of an interesting process because essentially, remember that Rome begins to collapse and has fully collapsed by about 479 CE. Western Rome is gone. You do have some of the Eastern Roman empires that still exist, but they are not enough to really reestablish the Roman power. So as Rome collapses, as it falls piece by piece, the power structure that is Rome, that governmental power structure, also collapses. So the Middle East ends up going back to what it was before, and essentially that is a type of shamanistic animism for a religion. And it goes back to the tribalism of the region. Now, these tribes are actually highly competitive because they compete for natural resources such as water, caravans, and also tourism. Because the center of this area, one of the tourist highlights, is a city that becomes known as Mecca. And in Mecca, there is a black stone temple known as the Kaaba that is divinely produced. So in the time period that Muhammad is born, around 570 CE, you have this intense tribal conflict. You have temples and shrines, for example, to the 360 moon deities that exist for the lunar calendar in the area. It's kind of a really tough place to grow up. Muhammad is a rather unique individual because he's got a fairly tragic life. Now, to get to his heritage, let's take a quick look at the story of Abraham. So how is it that Islam sees itself as part of the Abrahamic tradition? Well, remember how I said you couldn't let go of Hagar and Ishmael? Here's why. According to the Quran, Abraham, also known as Ibrahim, has Hagar basically as a secondary wife. And because he is a good man, he is not going to be one who casts them out and just leaves them in the desert. What he does is he takes Hagar and Ishmael and he sets up a home for them in the area that will eventually become Mecca. Now it gets to be even more interesting because part of the reason that this region is already known at the time of Abraham is that there is a biblical story tied to it. So in the Quran, there is a story that describes Adam and Eve. And in the beginning, God makes them. He makes Adam out of clay. And there's this really I love this idea. He takes a handful of dirt from the earth, to make Adam. And there are all sorts of colors of sand and clay and dirt, and all of the colors of anything in the ground is in this handful of clay. And when he makes Adam, he basically implants within him all of the colors of humanity. So Adam's descendants can be of all different colors, right? So that's going to be an important thought. Well, Adam and Eve were basically, oh, and before I forget, Eve was also made from one of Adam's bones, but it's a backbone instead of the rib. And they were the first couple, and they're kind of living in paradise. And God says you can do anything you want, but do not touch these trees. Well, lo and behold, it's the same thing as when you tell a child, you can have anything you want in the fridge, just don't touch this cake for the bake sale. And what do you want more than anything? You want that cake. Well, Adam and Eve touched the tree. And God says, what did you do? And they said, we touched the tree. They admitted their sin. And God said, that is the one thing I told you not to do. Therefore, I must cast you out of paradise. But because you owned up to your sin, you can work your way back. And I will send you guidance. Now, that's going to become fairly important over time, because the guidance is going to come in the means of prophets and holy books. So in Islam, you have 25 named prophets in the Quran out of 124 to 144,000 unnamed prophets. So there's this long lineage, and a prophet is somebody who hears the word of God, becomes a messenger, and relays that message to a person, to a family, to a community, to a nation. All right? So you've got this powerful prophetic lineage, and then God does send down sacred books. And for Islam, some of these books do include the Torah and the Psalms and the Gospels. But the problem is that these books, unlike the Quran, are not sealed by God, and therefore they can be tampered with by humankind. And because of that, Muslims may read these sacred books, but they cannot make commentary upon them. All right? Just kind of bear all this in mind. Well, at the end of all this, of all of this lineage of prophets, Moses and the Jews, Jesus is in the Quran, and he is named more times than is Muhammad. And Mary pretty much gets her own chapter in here. It is interesting because Jesus is seen as basically a virginal birth. It is said that an angel blew the seed into Mary's womb, so she conceived virginally. When she gave birth, the people were going to kill her as an adulteress. And Mary said to God, what am I going to do? And God says, say nothing, but let the child speak. Point to the baby, which is what she does. And on his first day, baby Jesus speaks and says, I am sent by God. Do not harm this woman. So these stories show up in the Quran. Jesus was meant to be the final prophet, but due to the Roman Empire, according to the Quran, he ends up in a predicament where he's about to be crucified. The night before his crucifixion, essentially, he stands up and he says, God is going to take care of me, but I need a body double. I need someone to be crucified in my place. And one man stands up, and this process goes on, but this man is quite determined, and he decides that he will sacrifice himself. And so what happens is this body double is crucified, and Jesus is taken bodily up into heaven. Jesus stays in heaven. He is one of the only individuals who has never died, but he is destined to come back at the end of time, finish his ministry, get married, have a family, and die. But until that time, God sent down another prophet. So in 570, Muhammad is born, and Muhammad has a fairly tragic story because just days before his birth, his father was killed. His mother dies when he's 6 years old, and so he goes to live in the household of his grandfather, who dies when he's about 8. And then Muhammad is raised by the head of his tribe, the Quraysh tribe. Now, the Quraysh tribe, interestingly enough, are descendants of Ishmael. So tying all of this together, remember the Kaaba, remember Adam and Eve. Here we go. When Adam and Eve were cast out of paradise, Adam looked back at God and at heaven, and he saw the angels worshiping God around a black stone temple. And he called out and he said, "May I build one of these on earth?" And God said, "Yes, you may." And so Adam builds the original Kaaba. But something happens, and that something is Noah's flood. And that original Kaaba is wiped out, leaving only the footprint. And when Abraham brings Hagar and Ishmael to that area, he comes back and forth between the families. So while he's maintaining his Jewish heritage, he also pays tribute to Hagar and Ishmael. And during these visits, he and Ishmael rebuild the Kaaba. Ishmael settles in the area and establishes the Quraysh tribe. Well, guess who is descended of the Quraysh tribe? The keepers of the Kaaba. That would be Muhammad and his family. So Muhammad comes from this wonderful lineage in a powerful tribe. However, the tribalism of the time is causing some issues. And so the Quraysh are, in essence, losing some of their political power in and amongst this power struggle of the tribes. Muhammad is actually sent to work. When he ends up with his uncle does send him out to tend to the sheep and to the flocks. And he also is educated by the Bedouin. He would have been educated with the Bedouin children, in particular on speech and law, astrology, archery, charioteer type activities, etc. There is a story that says when Muhammad was a young man, I believe he's about 10 years old, 10 to 12, and he's out with the Bedouin children, they witness an angel coming down from the skies. And this angel reaches into Muhammad's heart and he plucks out a single black speck, right? And so he takes out any of the sinful nature that Muhammad might have had. Now remember that there is no original sin in Islam or Judaism. That's just Christianity and partly Augustine of Hippo, Tertullian, and a few other folks that kind of mix that in. Islam, however, still says that Muhammad is a sinless man. He is the perfect man. That is why he is picked to be a prophet. So fast forward a few years. Muhammad grows up. He's about 25. He needs a job. He's walking into the city, but there's a little issue with the Kaaba. And that is that it is a tourist destination and tourists tend to walk around a lot and the structure was beginning to schism and to crack. So they had taken the Kaaba apart and were preparing to not rebuild it, but basically refortify it. Well, everybody wanted to carry the sacred cornerstone, the black stone that some say God sent from heaven, others say it was the stone that Adam stepped upon that absorbed the sin and his shame, essentially from being cast down from heaven. I mean, this is a godly element. And there's almost going to be a civil war over this. And so Muhammad comes forth and he says, well, friends, why don't you do this? Get a carpet, roll it out, place the cornerstone on the carpet, and each one of you lift a piece of that carpet and carry it together to the temple to be replaced. And the people are so happy that they ask Muhammad himself to put the stone into its slot. Right? So he has already gained a reputation for being honorable, for being intelligent, for being compassionate. So this kind of builds. Now, the second thing that happens is that he meets a widow by the name of Khadijah. She is upper class, but she has a caravan business. She's a widow. She's having some trouble running it because, remember, women at this time did not have a lot of power at all. So Muhammad needs a job, and she says, I tell you what, I will hire you to run a caravan route, and let's see how you do, how we work together. And she sends a little boy along, and the little boy is to kind of report back to her. And when Muhammad comes back, the little boy comes to Khadijah and says he was very honorable. He did not overcharge them. He did not undersell you. He was fair and equitable. Well, this is where things get interesting. Over a short period of time, Khadijah and Muhammad determine that they would make a very good couple. She is 40 years old and he is 25. She proposes marriage to him. I love that. I have friends who are women who keep saying, oh, he's never proposed to me, and they whine and kvetch, and I'm like, what? Khadijah, around 600 CE, proposed to Muhammad. I mean, geez Louise, get over it, ladies, right? So anyway, I always thought that was pretty cool. And she had to go to his family to ask for his hand in marriage, and it was, of course, granted. And they do a really beautiful job as a family. They have 2 sons who do die, and then they have 4 daughters, and there are people today who say they are descended from Muhammad. But they're a good power couple. Well, fast forward again. It's been 15 years. Imagine that you have a business, like, say, teaching, in which you deal with the public a lot. Well, there are times when you finish that you just kind of want to go and sit and be alone. I know during the breaks, I come home and I sit with the pugs and I enjoy the silence, right? Well, Muhammad's no different. He goes up into the mountains and he goes into the caves and he sits quietly to meditate. Well, one day, as he's doing this, he feels a presence, and this presence demands of him essentially to recite. And Muhammad says, what? I cannot do this. And the presence again says, recite. And Muhammad again denies it. And this pressure is growing more and more intense. And finally, he is commanded again, recite. And Muhammad says, I will do this. Who is Muhammad being visited by? And if you guess it's God, no, that's not right, because God would cause us probably to pop like a grape. It is the angel that showed up in the New Testament, a guy by the name of Gabriel. Gabriel is actually a pretty busy angel in Islam as well. He shows up for Hagar and Ishmael, creating water, a well for them. And then, of course, he's the presence for Muhammad, and he was also known as the announcer for Jesus. So, it makes some sense, though. Keep the same guy. Ultimately, Muhammad's very shaken, and he climbs down the mountain and goes home to his wife, and he says, honey, either I have gone crazy or I'm a prophet. And that's a very important thing, because what marks us from sanity and insanity is the ability sometimes to question what has happened to us. And so Khadijah says, well, my cousin Ali is very educated. Let's go to him and let's ask and let's see what you are. And they do. And Ali does some research and he comes back and he says, you know what? I think you're a prophet. Now here's where things get interesting. Remember that tie to the Roman Empire? Well, it turns out that there were Jews and Christians in the area, and many people actually believe that Khadijah and her family might have been basically a form of proto-Catholic, that they were Christian. So Muhammad says, okay, I'm a prophet. Guess who his first convert is? It's his wife. So I've always found this remarkable, because I think a lot of times people look at Islam and they kind of see a violent religion or an anti-feminist religion, when indeed it starts off very differently. Now, here's the thing. Muhammad goes out and he talks about reforming the world. And this means that the wealthy need to share their wealth. And he talks about women having rights, and that people need to realign themselves with God. And usually this goes pretty poorly. And in fact, Muhammad and his earliest followers, he gains just a small handful. I believe it's about 40 initially. And they are bombarded with insults. People throw mud at them while they're praying. They're threatened. They're beaten up. And this idea forms the first concept of the jihad. So when we hear the term jihad, most people think holy war. Well, the jihad has multiple meanings. And one of those is the internal struggle that we have to do what is right. So imagine that you're Muhammad. You've been called by God. And every day that you do what God wants you to do, and that's to be a prophet, to preach and share a sacred message, people hate you, right? How would you like to get up every day and have to deal with that? But he did. He struggled. He overcame those impulses, and he did the right thing. Well, over time, more and more people begin to follow Muhammad, and the upper classes start to become a little less comfortable. So what they end up doing is targeting Muhammad. And initially, Muhammad's uncle protected him. But in 1 year, Muhammad loses both his wife, Khadijah, who I think was both his emotional and financial support, although they did take all of that wealth that they had accumulated and made it into a community wealth. And his uncle, his political protection, dies. And now Muhammad's in trouble. All of a sudden, he gets a message from a place called Yathrib. We understand you're very good at making rules and law codes. Please come out and help us to create a town constitution. And Muhammad takes his followers, which is a small handful again, and they go across the desert, which is a long and difficult process. They kind of have to go quickly with what they have. And they go to Yathrib, and Muhammad sets up shop. In Yathrib, we actually have the development of the first mosque or masjid, in which essentially we have a wealthy man who gives Muhammad his house. They remove all of the furniture from the house, and they create prayer lines. According to Islam, you are to pray 5 times a day, and initially they turn towards Jerusalem, but later they do turn towards Mecca. So, in addition to that, we also have the first minaret, because to call for prayer, back in the old days, they didn't have a sound system or cell phones, so you climbed up this tall tower and you shouted out, "It is time to pray." Well, the first muezzin, or muezzin, is an Ethiopian man. He is the first man to go up and do this call to prayer from the minaret. And so we have some of these basic core values of Islam forming. All right, so Muhammad gets there to create a town constitution. And basically, he puts it out for the men, and the men vote, and they say, oh, it passed. Well, Muhammad then says, no, it hasn't. The women have not voted. I love that. The women have not voted. We are talking right around 611, 615 CE. He says women have the right to vote. America doesn't do that until 1919 to 1920. So that's radical. And the women come out, and of course, they ratify it. Well, the Meccans, the royals, the aristocracy, are very unhappy. They know Muhammad's still alive. They know he's still doing stuff, and they know he's still gaining in his fame. So they send a mercenary army of 1,000 men to go and get him. And as this army approaches, Muhammad only has an army of 300 men who are very small army in comparison and who are old or young. These are not battle-worthy men, if you will. This is the point where the jihad begins to change. The jihad is not only the internal struggle, it becomes known as the defense of the faith. You have the right to defend yourself. Now, Muhammad does create rules to warfare, and that's going to be important fairly soon. But what ends up happening is this 1,000-man mercenary army comes to fight these 300 men, and they can't win. They don't lose, but it's a draw. And this 1,000 troop army says, oh my gosh, this guy has got to have God on his side. And they say, we're going to convert. And they convert. And they convert their families. And now Muhammad has an army of about 10,000 people. And where do you go when you have an army of 10,000 in the ancient world? Anywhere you want. And he wants to go back to Mecca. So off they go. They get to Mecca, and the Meccans see this huge army. They know who is at the head of it, and they're really expecting to be destroyed. They surrender, hoping to minimize the damage, and Muhammad says, very well, I accept your surrender. He goes in, and he says, destroy all of the shrines, the untrue shrines, and he goes to the Kaaba, and within the Kaaba there is a statue of Mary holding Jesus, and he puts his cloak over that, and he says, destroy all of these other idolatrous statues. And he purifies the Kaaba, and he rededicates it to God. As for the Meccans, he accepts their surrender, and they are so astounded at his mercy that they end up converting. Now, there are a few things that Muhammad does that is unusual. Now, number one, remember that women at this period of time were considered essentially community property. This is pretty bad because this means that marriage has very little power for a woman, that women have basically no rights. As community property, essentially there would be no such thing, for example, as rape, because a woman would have no autonomy over her body. Muhammad actually comes up with a system that changes this. And he says, women have rights. Women are human. Women have a mind, and God gave them this mind. So one thing that he actually does is he revamps the marriage system. And he says men can only have up to 4 wives. Although in the Quran it says, if you cannot treat these wives exactly the same, then you should only have 1. And this is where I thought, I always laugh at this point because when I have face-to-face classes, I see the young men who are not married going, oh, 4 wives, that's awesome. And then I see the married men going, 4 wives, oh no, right? So you just have to kind of think about that. A man is expected to provide his wife and family with food, shelter, and clothing, the basic necessities. And marriage is the only appropriate place for sexuality. Now, people will say 4 wives. I mean, that's what? Yes, isn't that polygamy, or at least what do they call it? Not misogyny. I can't think of the word today. Multiple wives, not multiple marriages. And ultimately, the answer is, at least in Islam, well, what are y'all doing in the West? We may marry 4 wives, but there's a marriage contract. Usually the wives have to agree to another wife. Not always, but sometimes. If it's in the marriage contract, then it's required. We provide a household and a family, and we try to treat everyone fairly. We give the ability to women to have families and to have honor and sexuality in the appropriate context. Whereas in the West, y'all have 4 wives. You just have 1 at a time. All right? So it is kind of interesting. It's an interesting point. I don't know about you all, but I know multiple people who have been married multiple times, up to spouse number 3 or 4, right? So, depends on how you see it. Not me, but I do know people. All right. So Muhammad becomes kind of this great equalizer for the Middle East, and we start to see a third form of the jihad come to be, and that is the spreading of the faith. So Muhammad says, go out and convert others. The borders are rather expanded. Now in Islam, you cannot force conversion. People have to convert of their own free will. So that's a big, very important thing. But what you can do instead is to say, well, if you happen to be in a Muslim area, in an Islamic government, and you are not a Muslim, you cannot be part of the government. You're going to have to pay special non-Muslim taxes, and you're not going to have the same rights as a Muslim. So oftentimes what you would find is as the Islamic Empire expanded, people did convert. You still see some issues of this. For example, if you really want to research it, in Egypt, between the Coptic Christians and the Muslim Egyptians. And in fact, I've done interviews with Coptic Christians who've come to America who do describe things like their families in Egypt have to pay higher bills for sanitation and electric, and they do not have the rights to vote. And, there's a lot of a big difference. So kind of interesting. Now, Muhammad does say if somebody throws down their weapon, that is a surrender, and you are to stop fighting. If there is a surrender, you are not to mutilate the wounded or the dead. You are not to burn down the orchards or the farms. You are not to rape or attack the women, the children, or the elders. There are certain rules and regulations. And if you make a treaty, then you must honor it. This always reminds me of a Roman story, if you will. And this is actually where you see some of the Greek influence that comes through the Roman Empire into that area, these philosophies. But there's a guy named Cicero who writes about the de officiis, on duties. And he says, I knew this guy, this general, who made a treaty with the enemy army for 30 days. Well, because the treaty said that they were not fighting for 30 days, the general attacked them at night. Muhammad would say, no, that's not right. You have to have integrity. Islam also promotes ideas of racial equality. Again, remember, there are some theories that Hagar herself came from Africa. And that basically humanity is all kind of a series of tribes that should answer to the tribal leader of God. Now, in Islam, the name of God is Allah. What does Allah mean? It means the God. If you happen to be anywhere in the world, it's kind of like if you're Spanish and you say God is Dios, or, it's just the name for the God. Now, Islam is very strict that there is one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. All right, what else do I want to tell you about? Well, Muhammad unifies the Middle East. There's an actual birth date for Islam of 611 CE. And as he unifies the Middle East, there's actually kind of a peaceful reign until he passes around 632 CE. He gives a final sermon, and then I believe he dies of fever. And this is where we start to see a bit of a schism form. You've hopefully heard the terms Sunnah and Shiite, or Shia, depending. Shiite. And the idea here is that upon Muhammad's deathbed, some people believe that he appointed Ali to take over his ministry, to be the next Khalifa, or the next person to create a government with Islamic laws. Others, not knowing about this, followed the Quran and elected a new leader. Well, the ones who said that Muhammad pointed out and picked a leader believed that those who elected one acted in haste. And so you end up with a schism. The Sunnah are the larger of the population, about 80 to 85%, and they believe that the ascension from Muhammad is election or community-based. The Shiite believe that a family lineage happened that lasted for either 7 or 12 generations, because there are a couple of subdivisions, and they actually have slightly different practices. In addition to that, when Muhammad dies, the unity of the Middle East kind of dissipates. Now, Muhammad's miracle is the Quran. And this is where things get interesting, because when Muhammad dies, remember that he is essentially illiterate. He doesn't write. What would happen is, as God came upon him, as these messages came to him, he would go into a trance. He would physically transform. There's even one story that says he was riding on a camel when the trance came upon him, and when he awoke, this poor camel was splayed out in the desert, who couldn't stand because Muhammad had become so heavy with the word of God. Well, he had followers who were educated, and they would write everything down on anything they could because they were poor. So they would write on bones and potsherds and paper. It was an odd collection. They had stones, whatever was at hand, they would write this upon. Well, after Muhammad dies, these scholars, these writers begin to drift apart. They go back to their tribes, and multiple versions of the Quran begin to pop up. So the Khalifa basically sends out people to find all of the pieces of the Quran, but they have to be witnessed by 4 people who saw Muhammad say them, and only these are accepted and gathered together and placed in size order into the sacred book, which is the Quran. Now, the Quran is going to be Muhammad's miracle. And if you've never seen one, it's hard to do with one hand. They are beautiful books, but a true Quran must be written in Arabic. It cannot be translated. There are translations of the Quran, and you will see it will say the illustrious translation of the Quran, but a true Quran is sealed in Arabic. Muhammad has many interesting things that happen to him, but the Quran is his miracle. It is said that there are challenges to create something as beautifully poetic as the Quran, and nobody has been able to do it. So, the Quran is brought together, it is canonized, it is sealed, and it is officially sealed by God, which means that it cannot be tampered with. And so Muslims believe that the Quran is truly the word of God. It is untampered with. It is pure and straight from Muhammad's recitations. And Quran itself means recitation. The second thing that happens is that Muhammad, the life of Muhammad, it's called The Life and the Sayings of the Prophet. These are gathered up into a secondary book that is put together about 100 years after Muhammad dies, and this is also sometimes called the Sunnah, or the Hadith. All right, so other things that happen. So I mentioned women. Muhammad does revolutionize not only marriage, which, by the way, if you are a Muslim, hardcore dating doesn't exist. Marriages are arranged. A dowry is presented to the bride, and so it's seen a little bit differently. You don't have to buy a bride. You are essentially, you don't have to sell the bride. There we go. She is essentially honorable, and she's bringing great value to your family. So there is a dowry. There is a marriage contract. She has the right to say no if she does not wish to marry. A father is supposed to research his daughter's potential husband to make sure that he's a good person. With marriage, wives are not considered the head of the household. It is the husband, and the husband must share his wealth to support the family. However, a wife may work, but the money she earns is technically her own, and if she shares it, it is charity. In addition to that, Muhammad says that daughters need to also have inheritance. This is a bigger deal than you'd think, because remember, if women are not included in the family, then they get nothing. They get no inheritance and they have no support. Well, sons get twice the amount that daughters get, but the sons must share theirs with their family, whereas the daughters keep theirs and can share them if they wish. So the dowry is something that she gets, if you will. The inheritance is something that she gets. She can work, she can be educated. What do we do about clothing? In Islam, the only thing the Quran says is that when a woman leaves her home, she should draw her cloak tightly about her. The interpretation of dress is basically cultural. It is not uncommon in most Abrahamic cultures for women to cover their hair. So in Christianity, up through probably the 1950s, although you still find some churches today, women used to wear hats to cover their hair. In Orthodox Judaism, women cover their hair or wear wigs because only their husbands can see their hair. In Islam, a woman will wear a hijab, all right, or sometimes, well, actually it's not a hijab, but they will sometimes wear the full body covering. Some cultures say that just the hands and face may show in a woman. And the idea is that she is not to be sexualized, that this makes you look at her in the eye and treat her not as a sexual object, but as a person with a mind. A lot of people don't realize that men have dress codes. Men must be covered essentially from the shoulder to the knee, or if they are outdoors, from the navel to the knee. So there is a sense of modesty for men as well. When it comes to things like money, money is seen as the lifeblood of existence. We do need it. The economy is important, and competition's okay as long as it doesn't become dirty. As long as it's not, and the translation is, as long as it's not backbiting. So that becomes a fairly significant element within Islam. You can work, you can be competitive, but money should not be the focus of your existence. You should dress well, but not extravagantly. You should not be threadbare either, have these kind of rags on. You need to dress appropriately. Now, there are 5 pillars of faith that Islam requires people to follow if you are Muslim. Now, there's some other ideals as well, and we'll try to touch on these. But in Islam, the first thing that you must do, the first of the 5 pillars, is the Shahada. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And you must believe this, and you must say it with genuine understanding and genuineness. You must believe this at least once in your life. That is what makes you a Muslim. Oftentimes, it is the first thing that a father will whisper into the ear of a newborn child. The second thing is prayer 5 times a day. This typically can take place in a mosque, but does not have to. It can be any clean place that you have. You are supposed to wash your hands, feet, and face. If you do go to a mosque, you stand shoulder to shoulder with the person next to you and you fill up prayer lines. If a prayer line becomes full, you start the next prayer line, but you are not supposed to kind of pick and choose your neighbor because all are one under God. There is full prostration to remind you to submit. Standing shoulder to shoulder protects you from the shaitan or the Satan. Satan cannot attack you, essentially, when you are shoulder to shoulder with your neighbor, right? Because of the full prostration, men usually pray towards the front and women will pray towards the back, like in a separate room. They all face the same direction, but there is segregation based upon sex. Women are supposed to pray. They can take a break if they are experiencing their menstruation, and ideally they're not supposed to touch a Quran without gloves at that point either. They do not have to make up those prayers, menstruation or pregnancy. If you cannot physically prostrate yourself, you do as much as you can. Even if you are completely paralyzed, you can follow the prayer with your eyes. 5 times a day means that you're constantly drawn back into the religious world. So you've got morning, noon, afternoon, evening, and night. And so your mind is constantly brought back to God. Then you actually have charity or zakat, 2.5% of holdings over 2.2 ounces of gold that you've had for a year are to go to the poor, directly to the poor. This isn't to the mosque, this is to the poor or those in need. And again, that's once a year. You are to fast for the month of Ramadan. Now, Ramadan is a sacred month. It celebrates Muhammad's journey, his recitation. There's a night of power. It's very, very exciting. And at the end of it, you have the Eid al-Fitr, the breaking of the fast. This is going to be quite significant because a lot of people don't understand that when people fast for a month, what they mean is you fast from sunup to sundown, and then you eat sparingly. You are supposed to control yourself. It is a form of self-control. It is a form of understanding how others who do not have what you have feel. And it's a sense of religious worship. If you are sick and you cannot fast, then you pay for a meal for a needy family for every day. If you are sick, like you have a cold, and not like, if you cannot fast, it's because you've got something perhaps like you need insulin or you have diabetes, so you have to keep up a certain level. Then you offer sustenance to the poor. If you happen to have a cold or something like that, and fasting is not a good idea, then you make those fasting days up at the end. Women on menstruation do not have to fast, but they do have to make them up at the end. The final of the part of the pillars, the fifth one, is the Hajj. And this is something you're supposed to do once in your lifetime, and that is go on a trip to Mecca. Here you actually circle the Kaaba. You follow the path of Hagar when she was looking for water. You follow the path of Muhammad, right? Going out into the desert. You go to the mountain, and there you pray for the height of the Hajj. Is this day of prayer in which it's you and God alone. Amongst the sea of people, God and you are communicating. And you try to come out of the Hajj a better person, a changed person, right? You don't just come back to the world and pick it up again. You come back and you behave like a Muslim, like you are purified, that you are cleared of these sins, and that you are a new person with a new awareness. So the prayer and spending time on Mount Arafat, this very significant mountain, and you have to be within the borders of Arafat. This is kind of this pinnacle of just direct contact. It's preparation for Judgment Day. All right. If you are too sick to go on Hajj, somebody can go in your place, or you are forgiven and you don't have to do it. Hajj is fairly expensive as well. A couple years ago, it was at least $7,000 to go. It is not a pleasure trip. And in order to go to Mecca, you must be Muslim, and you have to be a documented Muslim. And so usually there's a lot of paperwork and a lot of study that goes along with this. There are basically Hajj groups that you join and you study. All right. Other beliefs within Islam. In the beginning, God made three creatures: man from clay, jinn from fire, and angel from light. There is a belief in the jinn and the angels. Angels are all around us. And in fact, when we are born, angels are assigned to us, and they follow us, and they write down what we do, both good and bad, in our book of deeds. The angels only leave us alone during sexual intercourse and when we're in the restroom. Otherwise, they are watching and following you. When you die, your soul is kind of stored in a storage place, but at the end of time, there will be an apocalypse and a resurrection. On Resurrection Day, the world is different. It's like the sun is just like a mile away from the earth, right? And you stand before God naked, and you're being judged. But it turns out that God isn't really judging you. You've already judged yourself. Remember that book of deeds? It is handed to you, and if it's handed to you in your right hand, you're going to heaven. If it's handed to you in your left hand, you're going to hellfire. And these are absolute places well described in the Quran. And if it's handed to you in your left hand behind your back, you're going to go to hellfire for a period of time and then go to heaven. There's a belief in preordination, not predestination, but preordination, that God knows how long you're going to live and what you're going to do and how much you're going to eat. God already knows all of this. It does get to be interesting because with preordination, God has determined when you shall die. And they actually say that an angel comes to collect the soul. So at 4 months in the womb, the roh, or the soul, is put into the womb of the and put into the fetus by an angel. And at the end, an angel comes to claim that soul. So, and I love this because there are people who survive miraculously these horrible events. They should have died, but they don't. Well, it's because it wasn't their time. The angel did not come to collect their soul. And at other times, you have these wonderfully healthy people who just die because it was their time. The angel came and collected their soul, right? So I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I really want to talk about in this video. I am trying to make these a little shorter because I know the Abrahamic, they're long religions. I will show you, these are Islamic prayer beads, and these were given to me by a man by the name of Dr. Sultan, and bless his heart, he was from Jordan. He was the head of a mosque, the largest mosque in the Southeast United States. And he very faithfully came and spoke to my classes for probably 15 years. I'm very sorry to say he passed away, but he was a remarkable man, and I really admired him. And it was funny because knowing somebody that long, you hear about his kids, graduating high school and going to college and getting married and then having grandchildren, and he loved those grandchildren. But I think what was so remarkable about him is that towards the end, I believe his kidneys were shutting down. I never got a full diagnosis, but from what I understand, he was definitely in dialysis. And he would actually come and speak. Even if he couldn't stand up, he would still come and talk to the students because it was that important to him to try to create a bridge between cultures. And I just thought that was really neat. And as I said, he did give me the Islamic prayer beads, so kind of a neat thing. The other thing you might want to look into a little bit with this religion is that of the Sufi. The Sufi is an offshoot that kind of forms around the 9th to 10th century CE. It comes from the word suf, or woolen. So there were times in which Islam had its own internal critics. And these critics basically said Islam was getting to be too worldly, which should sound familiar. You get the Protestant Reformation. And so the Sufi are those that try to return to a more mystical connection to God. And there's kind of a basic philosophy that says, and this is very basic, but the idea is that God is like a fire. And you can see God, and as you you can see the fire, right? So it's external, but it becomes part of you. But as you come closer to the fire, you can hear it. And so it becomes even more internal to you. And then you can step into the fire, right? You can have this direct religious experience with God that is very intense and very mystical. One of the most commonly known in the West are the whirling dervishes, these gentlemen who spin in these beautiful outfits, and they spin in circles, and they represent the universe and the solar system, and it's fantastic. Islam is rather unique because it does utilize reason. It does say that God gave us reason, and because God gave us reason, we should explore the world. And so one thing that's really cool is that the Islamic Empire was so much more advanced than anything in the West for a very long time. They had brain surgery, and they had dentistry, and they had an understanding of the world that was totally different than the Christians at the same time. So I suppose that is my call. But I hope that this video helped you a little bit with Islam. And basically make sure that you look at the instructor notes, and we'll touch base again. Take care.